Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for tuning in again. Tonight we're jumping into some unsettling true horror stories that'll make you think twice about everyday encounters. So get comfortable, or maybe not too comfortable, and let's get started.
I was an avid hiker and loved spending weekends exploring new trails. One summer, I decided to take a solo trip to a remote national park that had been recommended by a friend. The park was known for its stunning views and solitude, which sounded perfect for a weekend getaway. I packed my gear, filled my water bottles, and set out early Saturday morning. The first day went smoothly. I hiked for hours, enjoying the beautiful scenery and the quiet serenity of the woods. I set up camp at a designated spot near a lake and cooked myself dinner. As the sun set, I felt a sense of peace, grateful for the opportunity to escape from the hustle of everyday life. That night, I was awoken by a rustling noise outside my tent. It was probably just a raccoon or something, I told myself. But as I lay there, I felt uneasy. I reached for my flashlight and shined it through the tent, but there was nothing. I fell back asleep, still feeling a bit anxious. The next morning, I packed up my gear and continued my hike. As I walked, I noticed that the trail seemed less traveled. It was eerily quiet, and I began to feel like I was being watched. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Around mid-afternoon, I came across a group of hikers who seemed lost. They were a family, mom, dad, and 2 kids, and they looked disheveled. "Have you seen anyone else out here?" the dad asked, panic in his eyes. "We were separated from our friend yesterday, and he hasn't come back." My heart sank. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail since I'd arrived. I stayed with them for a bit, offering my phone, but there was no signal. The family decided to turn back and retrace their steps. I figured I should do the same. As I headed back to the trailhead, I heard a branch snap behind me. I turned, but no one was there. The feeling of being watched returned with a vengeance. I quickened my pace, adrenaline pumping. Once I got back to the parking lot, I found a ranger who was already organizing a search for the missing man. They had been looking for him since the previous night. I left, shaken, but relieved to be back in civilization. Weeks later, I learned they found the man's belongings a few miles down the trail, but he was never found. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that I narrowly escaped something sinister in those woods. My first year in college was a whirlwind of new experiences, late-night study sessions, and unforgettable friendships. I was assigned a roommate named Sarah, and at first we got along great. She was fun, outgoing, and had a ton of friends. We bonded over late-night talks and our shared love of coffee. As the semester progressed, I noticed some odd behaviors from her. She would often disappear for days at a time without telling anyone where she was going. I'd ask her about it when she returned, and she would brush it off, saying she was just visiting friends in another dorm or exploring the city. I was a bit worried, but figured she was just living the typical college life. One weekend, Sarah went missing again, but this time it was different. I hadn't seen her for over a week. I tried texting her, but she wouldn't respond. I asked some of her friends, but they hadn't seen her either. Panic set in as the days turned into a week. I decided to report her missing to campus security. They took it seriously and started looking into her whereabouts. They checked her social media accounts, and it turned out she had been posting pictures from a party several nights before she disappeared. The last post was a video of her with a group of people I didn't recognize, laughing and dancing. Days turned into weeks, and the search continued. I was terrified, feeling responsible since I had been her roommate. It wasn't until the semester ended that I finally learned what happened. A few weeks after she vanished, police discovered her belongings in a rundown house on the outskirts of town. Apparently, she had been involved in a drug ring and had tried to escape. There were reports of violence linked to the house, but they never found Sarah. It hit me hard. How could someone I knew, someone I shared my life with for months, be wrapped up in something so dangerous. I graduated that year with a heavy heart, forever wondering what happened to my college roommate and if she was still alive. A group of friends and I had been planning our annual camping trip for months. We chose a secluded area in the mountains that was supposed to be a hidden gem, away from the noise of everyday life. On a Friday evening, we piled into our cars and drove for hours until we finally reached the campsite. The sun was setting, casting a beautiful glow over the trees, and everyone was excited to set up camp. We spent the first night laughing, roasting marshmallows, and sharing stories around the fire. Everything felt perfect. But the next morning, things took a turn. One of our friends, Tom, decided to go for an early morning hike alone, which didn't sit well with me. I urged him to take someone with him, but he insisted he'd be fine and that he just wanted some peace and quiet. We went about our day, hiking and exploring the area, but as night fell, Tom still hadn't returned. I started to worry, but everyone else shrugged it off, saying he'd probably lost track of time. "He's a grown man. He'll find his way back," someone said. As the hours dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We decided to split up and search for him. I took a flashlight and headed down the trail he had taken. I called his name, my voice echoing in the stillness of the woods. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon Tom's backpack lying near the edge of a cliff. Panic surged through me. I shouted his name, but there was only silence. I retraced my steps and made my way back to the campsite, my heart pounding. We reported his disappearance to the authorities, and a search party was organized. They scoured the area for days, but all they found were a few personal items. It was like he had vanished into thin air. Months later, they declared him a missing person, and the case went cold. I still think about that trip and wonder if I could have done something differently. Tom was a great friend, and the thought of him being out there alone, lost, still haunts me. When I was in my early 20s, my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous road trip across the country. We planned to hit all the national parks and camp along the way. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime, and I was so excited to spend time with my friends. On the third day of our journey, we found ourselves in a remote area in the middle of nowhere. We pulled over at a small diner for breakfast, and while we were there, we met a couple of locals who seemed friendly enough. They recommended some hiking spots nearby and told us about a hidden waterfall that wasn't in any of the tourist guides. After breakfast, we decided to check it out. The locals gave us directions, and we set off, eager for adventure. The hike was beautiful, but as we got deeper into the woods, the path became less defined. We reached the waterfall, and it was stunning, clear water cascading down the rocks. We spent a few hours swimming and taking pictures. As we made our way back, one of my friends, Lisa, suggested we take a different route. She had a better idea of how to get back to the car. Reluctantly, we followed her, but soon we realized we were lost. The trail we were on began to fade, and the trees around us looked eerily similar. Panic set in when the sun started to set. We called out for Lisa, but she had wandered off ahead. We called her name for what felt like hours, but there was no response. I was terrified. We decided to split up to look for her, and I teamed up with Mike. After searching for a while, we finally stumbled upon Lisa's backpack, but she was nowhere to be found. We tried calling her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Fear began to consume us as we retraced our steps, desperately trying to find any trace of her. Eventually, we made our way back to the car and called the authorities. A search party was organized, but they didn't find any sign of Lisa. Days turned into weeks, and still nothing. The last we heard was that she was declared missing. That trip, meant to be filled with fun and laughter, turned into a nightmare that none of us could shake. I still wonder what happened to Lisa, and whether she was lost, or something more sinister occurred that day. It was a hot summer day, and my friends and I decided to spend the day at the beach. We lived in a small coastal town where everyone knew each other, and our beach was usually packed with families, surfers, and sunbathers. That day, however, it felt eerily quiet, like something was off. We set up our spot, laid out our towels, and jumped into the water. As we swam, I noticed a girl a little further down the beach who seemed out of place. She was by herself, sitting on a towel and staring out at the ocean. She had long, dark hair and wore a red bikini. I could see she was crying, but I didn't want to pry. My friends and I spent the day splashing around, building sandcastles, and enjoying the sun. A few hours later, I decided to take a break and grabbed a soda from the cooler. As I was walking back, I saw the girl still sitting there, but now her towel was empty. I looked around, hoping to see someone with her, but there was no sign of anyone. I felt a strange pull to go over and check on her, so I walked closer. When I got to her spot, I noticed her belongings were still there, including her phone and bag. I called out, "Hey, are you okay?" No response. I scanned the beach again, but there was still no sign of her. A sense of unease washed over me. I ran back to my friends and told them about the girl. We alerted the lifeguard, and he quickly ran down to where she was last seen. He called for backup, and soon, the police arrived. They began searching the area, but hours passed, and there was still no sign of her. Her things were still on the beach, but she was gone. We learned later that the beach had been closed for safety reasons due to rough currents that day. It was entirely possible she had gone for a swim and hadn't returned. Days turned into weeks, and the authorities held search parties, but no trace of her was found. It shook our small town to its core. I still think about that girl and wonder what happened to her. Did she drown? Was she kidnapped? Every time I go to the beach, I can't help but feel a lingering dread in the back of my mind. During my sophomore year of college, I made some new friends, and we all decided to celebrate the end of finals week with a weekend road trip to a nearby city. We were excited to explore the nightlife and unwind after a stressful semester. One of our friends, Jenna, was particularly enthusiastic about the trip. She had been looking forward to it for weeks and had even made plans to meet some friends from high school in the city. We left early Friday morning and arrived in the early afternoon. After checking into our hotel, we headed out to explore. Everything was going great until that night when Jenna announced she was going to meet her high school friends at a bar downtown. We all wanted to join her, but she insisted she'd be fine on her own. She promised to text us as soon as she got there. After a few hours of dancing and drinks, we began to notice Jenna hadn't texted. I pulled out my phone and saw that it was already past midnight. I texted her, but there was no response. After another hour passed, I started to get worried. I suggested we head to the bar she mentioned to check on her. When we arrived, the bar was packed, but there was no sign of Jenna. We asked the bartender, and he told us he hadn't seen her. Panic started to set in. I checked my phone again, but still no response. We decided to split up and search the surrounding area, but after an hour, we had no luck. By 3 a.m., we returned to the hotel feeling defeated. I couldn't sleep, constantly checking my phone, hoping for a message. Finally, around 5 a.m., I received a text from Jenna. She said she had met up with her friends and decided to stay at one of their places for the night. Relieved but frustrated, I texted her back, but she never replied. The next day, she showed up at the hotel, looking disheveled and exhausted. She explained that her friends had gotten into some sketchy situations and she had to leave them behind. She got lost trying to find her way back, but eventually made it to the hotel. The experience shook her, and I realized how easily a fun night could have turned into something horrifying. We were lucky she returned, but it served as a harsh reminder to always prioritize safety, especially when you're in unfamiliar places. My family holds a reunion every few years at a large cabin in the woods. It's a chance for everyone to catch up, share stories, and enjoy each other's company. This year, we decided to head to a remote cabin that belonged to my uncle. It was beautiful, but isolated, surrounded by dense trees and a lake. On the first night, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and reminiscing. My cousin, Lily, who was around 10 at the time, was particularly lively. She kept running off to explore the area, much to her mother's annoyance. After a few hours, we decided to call it a night, and everyone went to bed. The next morning, I woke up to a commotion outside. I rushed out of my cabin and saw several family members searching the area, looking frantic. I learned that Lily was missing. Panic set in as we realized she hadn't come back after going out to play the previous night. We searched the surrounding woods, calling her name, but there was no response. As the hours passed, the mood shifted from worried to desperate. We contacted the authorities, and they dispatched search and rescue teams. Helicopters flew overhead, and search dogs were brought in. I could see the fear in my aunt's eyes as she sobbed, clutching Lily's favorite toy. Days went by, and the search continued, but Lily was never found. It was heartbreaking to watch my family fall apart, each of us grappling with the unknown. The authorities investigated the area thoroughly, but there were no leads. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Months later, my family gathered again, but the atmosphere was heavy with grief. Lily's disappearance cast a shadow over our gatherings, and every time we met, we couldn't help but think of her. The woods that once felt inviting now seemed haunting, and I often wonder what happened that night. Was she lost? Did someone take her? The uncertainty still lingers, a dark cloud over our family. A few years ago, I was driving across the country for a new job opportunity. I had been on the road for hours, and as the sun began to set, I realized I needed to stop for gas. I pulled into a small truck stop in the middle of nowhere. The place was dimly lit and sparsely populated, but I didn't think much of it at the time. After filling up, I decided to grab a snack inside. The convenience store was small, with a few shelves of snacks and drinks. As I walked in, I noticed a man sitting at a table in the corner, staring at me. He looked disheveled and unkempt, which made me feel uneasy, but I brushed it off and continued to the register. After paying for my snacks, I stepped outside and got into my car. As I sat there, I noticed the man had followed me outside. He was standing near the entrance, watching me intently. My heart raced as I started my car, pretending to look for something in my bag. I watched him through my rearview mirror, and when I saw he was still just standing there, I decided it was time to leave. I pulled out of the gas station and onto the highway, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My instincts told me to keep an eye on the man, so I glanced back as I drove away. To my horror, I saw that he was now in a beat-up truck, tailing me. My heart sank as I realized he was intentionally following me. I tried to remain calm, focusing on the road ahead. I took a few random turns, hoping to lose him, but he mirrored my movements, staying close behind. I finally made a quick decision to pull into a fast food restaurant that was nearby. I parked in a well-lit area and rushed inside, hoping to shake him off. I watched through the windows as he parked his truck and got out, looking around. Panic surged through me as I spotted a police officer inside the restaurant. I quickly approached the officer and explained the situation. He took me seriously and agreed to check on the man outside. As the officer approached, the guy got back in his truck and sped away. The officer managed to get his license plate and promised to look into it. After that night, I felt a chill every time I passed that truck stop. I never found out who that man was or what he wanted, but I learned a valuable lesson. Always trust your instincts, especially when something feels off. Growing up in a small town, we often heard stories about a girl named Emily who had disappeared over a decade ago. Emily was a local high school student, known for her kindness and vibrant personality. One day, she left for a jog in the nearby woods and never returned. Despite extensive searches, no trace of her was found. Over time, the story faded into local lore, and most people moved on. but it never sat right with me. A few years later, I became friends with a girl named Mia, who had just moved to town. One night, as we were hanging out, the topic of Emily's disappearance came up. Mia was curious about the woods and insisted we explore them the following weekend. I hesitated, but eventually agreed, wanting to uncover the truth behind the legend. That Saturday, we drove to the entrance of the woods. The place felt eerie but intriguing. We hiked deeper, following the paths, and as the sun began to set, we stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Mia wanted to investigate, and despite my gut feeling that we shouldn't, I followed her inside. The cabin was dark and dusty, filled with old furniture and a lingering smell of mildew. As we explored, I noticed something strange. Mia seemed overly excited, almost too eager to explore. It made me uneasy. Suddenly, she stopped and pointed at a photo pinned to the wall. It was a picture of Emily from her yearbook. My heart raced as I realized we were in a place that might have been connected to her disappearance. As we turned to leave, the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but no one was around. Mia's demeanor shifted. She looked at me with a wild glint in her eyes. I began to panic, and it became clear that this wasn't just an innocent exploration. I managed to push the door open and ran out, but I could feel her chasing behind me. Once outside, I sprinted back to my car, heart pounding. I glanced back and saw her standing in the doorway, a chilling smile on her face. I drove away, never looking back. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that Mia knew more about Emily's fate than she let on. I've never spoken to her again, and I often wonder if she's still out there, waiting for someone else to uncover her dark secret. A few years ago, my friends and I went out for a night on the town to celebrate a birthday. We started at a local bar, enjoying drinks and laughter before heading to a club. The night was a blur of music, dancing, and fun. But one thing stood out: my friend Jake. He had been acting strangely all night, looking around anxiously and disappearing to make phone calls. Around 2 a.m., we decided to leave the club and head to a diner for some late-night food. Jake, however, claimed he needed to run a quick errand and told us to go ahead without him. We hesitated but eventually left, thinking he would catch up with us. After an hour at the diner, I checked my phone, expecting a text from Jake, but there was nothing. I started to get concerned, so I texted him to see where he was. No response. My friends brushed it off, thinking he must have just met someone and lost track of time. By the time we finished our meal, it was nearly 4 a.m., and Jake still hadn't shown up. I insisted we go back to the club to look for him. The bouncer said he hadn't seen Jake since earlier in the night. Panic set in, and I started calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. We drove around the area, looking for any sign of him. Eventually, we pulled up to a nearby park where we often hung out. As we walked through the dimly lit paths, I felt a chill run down my spine. We called out his name, hoping to hear a response, but it was eerily silent. After what felt like hours of searching, I spotted a figure sitting on a bench. As we approached, I realized it was Jake. He looked disheveled, his clothes torn, and his eyes wide with fear. He mumbled something about getting jumped by a group of guys in the alleyway behind the club. He had tried to fight them off, but ended up running into the park to hide. We took him home that night, relieved he was safe but deeply shaken by what had happened. He reported the incident to the police the next day, but they found no evidence of the attackers. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of dread from that night. I keep wondering what could have happened if we hadn't gone back for him. Would he have been another name on the list of missing persons? Growing up, my family went camping every summer at a local campground. It was a tradition I cherished, full of memories and adventures with my siblings. One summer, while we were setting up our tents, I noticed a girl around my age sitting alone at the edge of the woods, her gaze fixed on the ground. She had a somber look about her, which made me curious. I asked my parents if I could go talk to her, and they agreed, telling me to be careful. As I approached, I introduced myself and asked if she was okay. Her name was Sarah, and she told me she was camping with her family, but felt overwhelmed. We talked for a while, and she opened up about feeling out of place and disconnected. I invited her to join us for a campfire later that night. As the sun set, our family gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. I was relieved to see Sarah join us, and she seemed to brighten up. My siblings welcomed her, and for a brief moment, everything felt perfect. But as the night wore on, I noticed her becoming distant again. She excused herself and walked toward the woods. Worried, I followed her, calling out her name. She turned to me and said she needed some air. I offered to go with her, but she insisted she was fine. Reluctantly, I returned to my family, glancing back at her as she disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, I woke up early to see if Sarah was around. When I didn't see her, I asked my parents if they had seen her. They hadn't. I decided to search for her near the area we had met, but there was no sign of her. I felt uneasy as I wandered deeper into the woods, calling her name. Hours later, I reported her missing to the campground staff, and they began a search. We combed the area, but there was no trace of her. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah's disappearance became the talk of the campground. It turned out her family had left without her, and no one knew what had happened that night. I've always wondered if I could have done something differently to prevent her from disappearing into those woods. To this day, the memories haunt me, and every time I hear someone mention camping, I can't help but think of Sarah and what might have happened to her. Growing up in a small town, we often heard stories about a girl named Emily who had disappeared over a decade ago. Emily was a local high school student, known for her kindness and vibrant personality. One day, she left for a jog in the nearby woods and never returned. Despite extensive searches, no trace of her was found. Over time, the story faded into local lore, and most people moved on, but it never sat right with me. A few years later, I became friends with a girl named Mia, who had just moved to town. One night, as we were hanging out, the topic of Emily's disappearance came up. Mia was curious about the woods and insisted we explore them the following weekend. I hesitated, but eventually agreed, wanting to uncover the truth behind the legend. That Saturday, we drove to the entrance of the woods. The place felt eerie but intriguing. We hiked deeper, following the paths, and as the sun began to set, we stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Mia wanted to investigate, and despite my gut feeling that we shouldn't, I followed her inside. The cabin was dark and dusty, filled with old furniture and a lingering smell of mildew. As we explored, I noticed something strange. Mia seemed overly excited, almost too eager to explore. It made me uneasy. Suddenly, she stopped and pointed at a photo pinned to the wall. It was a picture of Emily from her yearbook. My heart raced as I realized we were in a place that might have been connected to her disappearance. As we turned to leave, the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but no one was around. Mia's demeanor shifted. She looked at me with a wild glint in her eyes. I began to panic, and it became clear that this wasn't just an innocent exploration. I managed to push the door open and ran out, but I could feel her chasing behind me. Once outside, I sprinted back to my car, heart pounding. I glanced back and saw her standing in the doorway, a chilling smile on her face. I drove away, never looking back. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that Mia knew more about Emily's fate than she let on. I've never spoken to her again, and I often wonder if she's still out there, waiting for someone else to uncover her dark secret. A few years ago, my friends and I went out for a night on the town to celebrate a birthday. We started at a local bar, enjoying drinks and laughter before heading to a club. The night was a blur of music, dancing, and fun. But one thing stood out. My friend Jake. He had been acting strangely all night, looking around anxiously and disappearing to make phone calls. Around 2 a.m., we decided to leave the club and head to a diner for some late-night food. Jake, however, claimed he needed to run a quick errand and told us to go ahead without him. We hesitated but eventually left, thinking he would catch up with us. After an hour at the diner, I checked my phone, expecting a text from Jake, but there was nothing. I started to get concerned, so I texted him to see where he was. No response. My friends brushed it off, thinking he must have just met someone and lost track of time. By the time we finished our meal, it was nearly 4 a.m., and Jake still hadn't shown up. I insisted we go back to the club to look for him. The bouncer said he hadn't seen Jake since earlier in the night. Panic set in, and I started calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. We drove around the area, looking for any sign of him. Eventually, we pulled up to a nearby park where we often hung out. As we walked through the dimly lit paths, I felt a chill run down my spine. We called out his name, hoping to hear a response, but it was eerily silent. After what felt like hours of searching, I spotted a figure sitting on a bench. As we approached, I realized it was Jake. He looked disheveled, his clothes torn, and his eyes wide with fear. He mumbled something about getting jumped by a group of guys in the alleyway behind the club. He had tried to fight them off, but ended up running into the park to hide. We took him home that night, relieved he was safe but deeply shaken by what had happened. He reported the incident to the police the next day, but they found no evidence of the attackers. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of dread from that night. I keep wondering what could have happened if we hadn't gone back for him. Would he have been another name on the list of missing persons? Growing up, my family went camping every summer at a local campground. It was a tradition I cherished, full of memories and adventures with my siblings. One summer, while we were setting up our tents, I noticed a girl around my age sitting alone at the edge of the woods, her gaze fixed on the ground. She had a somber look about her, which made me curious. I asked my parents if I could go talk to her, and they agreed, telling me to be careful. As I approached, I introduced myself and asked if she was okay. Her name was Sarah, and she told me she was camping with her family, but felt overwhelmed. We talked for a while, and she opened up about feeling out of place and disconnected. I invited her to join us for a campfire later that night. As the sun set, our family gathered around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. I was relieved to see Sarah join us, and she seemed to brighten up. My siblings welcomed her, and for a brief moment, everything felt perfect. But as the night wore on, I noticed her becoming distant again. She excused herself and walked toward the woods. Worried, I followed her, calling out her name. She turned to me and said she needed some air. I offered to go with her, but she insisted she was fine. Reluctantly, I returned to my family, glancing back at her as she disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, I woke up early to see if Sarah was around. When I didn't see her, I asked my parents if they had seen her. They hadn't. I decided to search for her near the area we had met, but there was no sign of her. I felt uneasy as I wandered deeper into the woods, calling her name. Hours later, I reported her missing to the campground staff, and they began a search. We combed the area, but there was no trace of her. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah's disappearance became the talk of the campground. It turned out her family had left without her, and no one knew what had happened that night. I've always wondered if I could have done something differently to prevent her from disappearing into those woods. To this day, the memories haunt me, and every time I hear someone mention camping, I can't help but think of Sarah and what might have happened to her. I'll never forget the day my friend Claire vanished. We were just out of high school and still figuring out life. One warm summer night, we decided to go out for a ride along the coast with a couple of friends. The ocean breeze was refreshing, and we were blasting our favorite songs. Everything felt perfect, until we stopped at a secluded beach that was known for its stunning views. We set up a small bonfire, drinking and laughing as the waves crashed nearby. Claire seemed especially carefree that night, and it made me happy to see her like that. As the fire started to die down, Claire suggested we take a late-night drive up the coast to a viewpoint she loved. She was the only one sober enough to drive, and we all agreed. The four of us piled into her car, me in the passenger seat, and our two friends in the back. The road was winding and dark, illuminated only by the headlights of her car. Claire was singing along to the music, and we were all in high spirits. Suddenly, she slammed on the brakes, and we lurched forward. I looked up, confused, and saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a man, waving his arms wildly, as if he needed help. Claire hesitated but eventually rolled down the window. The man told us he had car trouble and needed a ride to the nearest gas station. I felt uneasy. There was something off about him. He was disheveled and had this wild look in his eyes. Claire, however, seemed eager to help. Before I could voice my concerns, she agreed to give him a ride. We squeezed him into the back seat, and I could feel the tension building. As we drove, the man kept glancing at Claire, making me even more uncomfortable. I tried to distract myself by chatting with our friends, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Suddenly, Claire pulled over near an abandoned gas station. She claimed it was the quickest way to help the guy out. As soon as we stopped, he jumped out of the car, muttering something about needing to grab his stuff. Claire insisted on following him, leaving me and our friends in the car. After a few minutes of waiting, I started to feel anxious. It had been too long. When we finally decided to check on them, Claire was nowhere to be found. We searched the area, calling her name, but it was like she had vanished into thin air. We drove back to the beach to report it to the police, but despite extensive searches, Claire was never found. I often wonder if that man had anything to do with her disappearance, or if I could have stopped her from going with him. The guilt eats at me every day. 2 years ago, my family held a reunion at our old family cabin in the mountains. It was a picturesque place, surrounded by trees and a serene lake, perfect for reconnecting and reminiscing. The first day was filled with laughter, games, and storytelling, but things took a strange turn on the second day. My cousin Jenna was the adventurous type, always looking for excitement. Early in the morning, she suggested we go hiking to a nearby waterfall. Everyone else was too busy with preparations for a big family dinner, but Jenna was insistent. Finally, I agreed to go with her, wanting to ensure she didn't wander off alone. We set off on the trail, chatting and laughing as we made our way through the woods. After about an hour, we reached the waterfall, and it was beautiful. The water cascaded down rocks, creating a pool at the bottom. We spent some time taking photos and enjoying the scenery, but as we prepared to head back, I noticed Jenna acting strange. She seemed distant and kept staring into the trees, as if she was searching for something. When I asked her what was wrong, she just shook her head and insisted she was fine. I didn't push it, thinking maybe she just needed a moment to herself. As we began our hike back, Jenna suddenly stopped and said she wanted to explore a little further down the path. I hesitated, but eventually agreed to let her go. I told her I'd wait for her at a nearby bench. She walked off, and I tried to relax, listening to the sounds of nature. After about 20 minutes, I started to worry. I called out her name, but there was no response. Panic set in as I realized she was taking longer than expected. I retraced my steps, calling for her, but she had vanished without a trace. I rushed back to the cabin, and we alerted the family. The search lasted for days, with volunteers scouring the woods, but Jenna was never found. The authorities concluded she must have gotten lost, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister had happened. Every year since, I think about that trip, and it breaks my heart to know that Jenna never came back. In my sophomore year of college, I lived in a small college town that had a reputation for being safe. However, That reputation was shattered when my roommate, Laura, went missing. It was a Wednesday night, and we had planned a study session for an upcoming exam. We were both stressed, but as the evening went on, Laura mentioned she needed a break. She suggested heading to a nearby diner for some coffee and pie, and I eagerly agreed. We walked over, chatting about our classes, and everything felt normal. After an hour or so, Laura received a text from a friend asking her to join a party at another house. I wasn't in the mood for partying, but she was excited, saying she'd only be gone for an hour. I told her to have fun, and she left the diner. When she didn't return after a couple of hours, I texted her, but there was no response. I assumed she was caught up in the party and figured I'd see her when she got back. But as the night dragged on and I received no updates, I started to worry. I decided to check her social media, and I saw she had posted a picture from the party with a caption about having a great time. That eased my worries for a moment, but as the clock ticked closer to 2 a.m., I still hadn't heard from her. I called her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. By the time morning came, panic set in. I reached out to our mutual friends, and they hadn't seen her either. We reported her missing to the campus police, who initiated a search. It wasn't until the afternoon that someone found her phone in a nearby park, but there was still no sign of Laura. Days turned into weeks, and eventually, the search was called off. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Did she get into trouble at that party? Did someone harm her? The thought of it haunted me. I moved off campus the following semester, but I still think about Laura and what happened to her every day. The college town that once felt so safe had turned into a nightmare, and it would never feel the same again. Back when I was in high school, I worked a part-time job at a local grocery store. It was a quiet place, especially during the night shift. Most of my coworkers were friendly, and I enjoyed stocking shelves and ringing up customers. But one night, everything changed. It was a Thursday night, and I was working with Mark, a guy who had been with the store for years. He was a bit odd but harmless. As we were finishing up closing procedures, I noticed he kept glancing toward the back of the store, almost like he was waiting for someone. I thought it was strange but didn't think much of it. As the clock neared midnight, a customer walked in, a middle-aged man who seemed out of place. He wandered through the aisles, muttering to himself. Mark seemed uneasy, and I could see him watching the man closely. I asked if he wanted me to call the manager, but he shook his head. Suddenly, the man approached us at the checkout and asked for the bathroom. Mark pointed him in the right direction, and the man disappeared down the aisle. I continued ringing up items, but Mark was visibly agitated. After a few minutes, the man hadn't returned, and I suggested we go check on him. As we walked toward the bathroom, I felt a knot in my stomach. When we reached the door, we knocked, but there was no answer. Mark opened the door slightly and called out, but still nothing. That's when I noticed the emergency exit door was slightly ajar, and my heart sank. We rushed outside but found nothing. The parking lot was empty, and there was no sign of the man. I suggested we call the police, but Mark insisted we wait a little longer. I was beginning to feel uncomfortable around him. Eventually, we decided to go back inside and finish closing the store. A few days later, I learned that a man matching the description of the customer had been reported missing in the area. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread, knowing we had seen him just before he vanished. I quit my job shortly after that, and I still think about that night. What if Mark knew more than he let on? Why was he so anxious? The whole experience left a mark on me, and I often wonder if that man ever returned home, or if something terrible happened that night. I never thought a simple hike could turn into a nightmare. A few years back, my friends and I planned a weekend camping trip in the national park. We were all experienced hikers, so the trails didn't intimidate us. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, excited to escape the city. That first evening, we set up camp, shared stories, and planned to hit the trails the next day. The next morning, We chose a challenging route that promised stunning views. There were 5 of us: me, Jake, Sarah, Tom, and Lisa. We packed our backpacks and hit the trail, the sun shining brightly overhead. The first few hours were great. We laughed, took photos, and enjoyed the beautiful scenery. However, as the day went on, the trail began to get steep, and the terrain became more rugged. Around midday, we reached a plateau with breathtaking views. We decided to take a break and snap some pictures. Lisa suggested we explore a nearby cliff to get an even better look. I wasn't keen on it, but she was insistent. Jake and Tom followed her, while Sarah and I hung back. After a while, I started feeling uneasy. The sun was dipping, and we hadn't planned on being out this late. I called out to the others to come back, but they didn't seem to hear me. Suddenly, I heard a loud shout followed by a crash. I rushed toward the sound, panic setting in. When I reached the edge of the cliff, I saw Lisa lying at the bottom. My heart sank. We hurried down to her, but it was too late. She was unconscious and bleeding. We immediately called for help, but it took hours for the park rangers to arrive. They had to use ropes to get us back up the cliff. When we got back to the campsite, Lisa was taken away, but she never regained consciousness. The authorities conducted a search for her and questioned us extensively. We were devastated. Lisa was missing for weeks before the search was officially called off. We all felt guilty. We should have never let her go near that cliff. Years later, I still think about that day. Every time I see a hiking trail, I remember how quickly a fun trip can turn into a tragedy. We lost our friend, and I can't shake the feeling that we could have done something differently to prevent it. It was a rainy Friday night when I decided to drive home from a friend's party in a small town. The roads were slick, and visibility was low. I had taken this route dozens of times before, but that night, it felt different. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was the isolation. I remember passing a sign for a small diner just off the road and thought about stopping for a cup of coffee. But I kept going. About halfway home, my car suddenly sputtered. The engine started to die, and I barely managed to pull over onto the shoulder. I sat there for a moment, cursing my luck. It was late, and there were hardly any cars on the road. My phone had no service, and I realized I was completely alone. I decided to wait for someone to pass by. After a while, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. My heart raced with hope. A pickup truck pulled over beside me, and a middle-aged man stepped out. He looked harmless enough, wearing a flannel shirt and a friendly smile. "Need a lift?" he asked, leaning against my car. I hesitated. I knew I should be careful, but I was desperate. "My phone's dead," I admitted. "My car just broke down." He offered to help. I figured I could trust him. He popped the hood and started checking the engine while I stood by nervously. After a few minutes, he declared that my battery was dead. "I can give you a jump," he said cheerfully, motioning to his truck. I agreed, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension as I climbed into his truck. The cab was cluttered with trash and had a strange smell. As he drove, I made small talk, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. Suddenly, he turned off the main road, heading down a dirt path. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just a shortcut," he replied, but I didn't like the way he said it. Panic surged through me, and I felt trapped. "Can you turn around? I think I left something at my car," I lied, my heart racing. He glanced at me, the smile fading from his face. "Relax, I'm just trying to help." I knew I had to act quickly. I opened the door and jumped out while the truck was still moving. I hit the ground hard, but forced myself to get up and run into the woods. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran until I finally found a road where I flagged down a passing car. They took me to safety, and I reported the incident to the police. They couldn't find the man, and to this day, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't escaped. That night taught me to trust my instincts, no matter how desperate the situation. It was supposed to be a fun weekend trip with friends to the beach. We had been planning it for weeks, and everyone was excited to relax, soak up the sun, and enjoy the ocean. There were 5 of us: me, my best friend Mia, and 3 of our guy friends, Mark, Alex, and Ryan. We packed our bags, rented a beach house, and set off on a Friday evening. The first night was great. We had a bonfire, made s'mores, and told stories late into the night. As the evening wore on, Mia suggested we go for a midnight swim. The boys were hesitant, but I encouraged them, and they eventually agreed. We ran down to the water, the moon illuminating the waves crashing against the shore. After a while, we got tired and decided to head back. But as we walked, Mia mentioned she wanted to stay for a bit longer to catch some waves. I felt uneasy. The ocean at night can be unpredictable, but she was insistent. "I'll be fine. Just keep an eye on me from the shore," she said with a laugh. We agreed to let her stay while the rest of us went back to the beach house. I kept looking back, watching her splash in the water until she was just a silhouette. As we settled in, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I decided to check on her after an hour. When I returned to the beach, she was nowhere to be found. I called out her name, but there was only silence. I ran back to the house, panicking. "Mia is missing," I shouted to the others. We all raced back to the water, calling her name and searching frantically. We spent hours looking along the shore and into the water, but there was no sign of her. Eventually, we called the police, who began a search. They found her belongings on the beach, but no trace of her. Days turned into weeks, and despite extensive searches, Mia was never found. The beach that had once seemed so beautiful became a haunting reminder of that night. Every time I see the ocean, I think of her. The guilt still eats at me. I should have insisted she come back with us. Now, every summer, when I think of the beach, I remember the fun we had and the pain of losing my best friend. It was a typical Friday night in college, and my friends and I were excited for a big party at a house off campus. It was one of those legendary bashes where everyone from our university was supposed to show up. I arrived with my roommate Jenna, and we quickly fell into the party atmosphere. The music was blasting, and people were dancing everywhere. We were having a great time, drinking and mingling with friends. As the night went on, Jenna mentioned she wanted to find some of our other friends who had arrived earlier. I didn't think much of it. She often liked to wander off in social settings. I told her I'd stay by the drinks, and she left to explore the crowd. An hour passed, and I hadn't seen her return. I texted her, but there was no response. I started to feel uneasy, so I asked around, but no one had seen her. I decided to look for her, moving through the throngs of people. I checked the living room, kitchen, and even the backyard, but she was nowhere to be found. Finally, I stepped outside for some fresh air, hoping she might be taking a break. As I looked around, I noticed a few people gathered near the side of the house, whispering. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached them. "What's going on?" I asked. They exchanged glances, and one girl nervously said, "Someone said they saw a guy leave with a girl, but we're not sure who it was." Panic coursed through me. I knew Jenna could be reckless at times, especially after a few drinks. I rushed back inside, my heart pounding. I grabbed my phone to call her, but again, no answer. I ran back to the party and told a couple of friends about my concerns. They promised to help me search, but as time passed, dread settled in. Hours later, after the party had dwindled, we called the police. They arrived and took our statements. I felt sick with worry. The next few days were a blur of searching and hoping for any sign of Jenna. Finally, a week later, we learned that Jenna had been found. She had been discovered a few blocks away, unconscious and disoriented. It turned out she had been drugged at the party and taken advantage of. The relief of finding her was overshadowed by the horror of what she had experienced. She was safe but traumatized, and our friendship would never be the same. The incident haunted me, and I still think about that night. What if I had stayed with her? What if I had insisted she didn't wander off? The guilt never really went away, and I wish I could change what happened.